Okay, it's time to pop in some Power Rangers Lightspeed Rescue for the Nintendo 64 and instantly regret it. There we go. Autofocus fail. There we go.
One of several video games based on the 2000 incarnation of the long-running Power Rangers franchise, Power Rangers Lightspeed Rescue featured 5 individuals being drafted by a naval base to become Power Rangers and defend the city of Mariner Bay from a group of demons who wished to take over the city so that they could rebuild their temple on the line that the city was built on, or something like that. That is the general basis of the series, but don't expect that to come into play into this game because it clearly doesn't. Interestingly enough, Lightspeed Rescue is the first incarnation since Power Rangers Zeo to get video games for the various home consoles, in this case, the Game Boy Color, the Sony PlayStation, and today's target, the Nintendo 64. Now each system received its own little video game to give console players their own piece of the Power Ranger pie. The Game Boy Color version was a platformer with various rescue missions and sword fights. The PlayStation version was a third-person brawler with sword fights. And then we have this Nintendo 64 version, which comprised 4 different playstyles. You have the standard Ranger levels where you're shooting magical pixie shots. Yes, magical pixie shots. You have the vehicle stages where you have to put out fires, clean up messes, and avoid traffic, which I'm filling at right now, as you can see. You have the jet levels where you have to pick up cargo all over the city. And then you have the Megazord fights, which is nothing more than a glorified poor man's first-person shooter. Oh yeah! Now when you fire the game up, you're greeted with the instrumental version of the Lightspeed Rescue theme song, and it sounds pretty good right off the N64. It's cool to see a video game play the show's theme song, much less get it down perfectly. At least that's your general thinking when you start the game. The theme song can also be heard during the main menu, the comic-style cutscenes, and the end credits. And by the end of the game, it starts to get on your nerves. I mean, play something else in the background besides the main theme, or some variation, but not the same song, please. Alas, that's not necessarily the case. Now, thankfully, the theme doesn't play during actual gameplay, but instead you're greeted with a mixtape of generic, uninteresting, boring gameplay music that drones constantly forever, shifting tones seemingly at random. And this looping montage of mediocrity is the only tune you'll be hearing on every single level in the game. Whether it be Ranger levels, Zord levels, whatever, it's the only in-game song throughout the entire game. That's it. Just a couple tracks at most. There is some voiceover work. Some of the cast of Lightspeed Rescue contributes some minor voice bites to the game, but they're really just generic sound bites that the game could have done without. There are sound effects in the game, nothing worthy to say about them, nothing really noteworthy, for that matter. They're just there. By the way, the cutscenes? Okay, let me be direct here, they suck. You have these poorly drawn, comic-like renderings of the Rangers and some of the supporting cast who barely look like the people they're supposed to represent. The dialogues in the clips are awful. Even the earliest episodes of the original Mighty Morphin Power Rangers have better dialogue than this. Hell, the earlier 16-bit Power Rangers games had better cutscenes and dialogues. Ugh. When the Zords transform, it's done in this poor man's PowerPoint presentation, and it's the same deal for all 3 Zords that you control in the game's storyline. And it looks bad. I mean, really, like the art style notwithstanding, it just looks bad. It's disheartening when a 16-bit Sega Genesis system can pull off a Megazord transformation better than the video game console with 4 times the bits. And the in-game graphics themselves, they're bland as vanilla. The rendering is alright with no real rough edges, but at times the textures are either extremely low resolution or just non-existent. It's not a visually impressive game either. It almost looks like someone took an ancient Atari Jaguar video game, reskinned everything to make it look more Power Ranger-y, dropped it onto a black Nintendo 64 cartridge, and voila! Brand new game! And this thing was released in 2000. Nintendo 64 was out for a while, several years, and that system had a number of quality titles that looked better than this, and that came before. Okay, let's get to the gameplay now, because this is where the game fails. Oh, it most definitely fails. As previously stated, Lightspeed Rescue comprises 4 different playstyles throughout the game's 20+ levels. The Ranger levels, the Driving levels, the Flying levels, and the Megazord levels. None of these are properly executed or in a way that makes them fun. Let's start with the Ranger levels. You guide your Ranger in an open area, fighting the various flavors of Batlings, the Grunt Soldiers, alongside the occasional boss monsters who were created especially for this game, and none of them come from the TV show. Sometimes you'll have an additional objective that you have to complete in order to clear the level. This could be rescuing stranded citizens, destroying logs, yes, really, logs, rescuing other Rangers, or just reaching a goal point. Simple, basic stuff, really. Controls are also fairly basic in this mode. You can move your ranger around with either the D-pad or the analog stick. There's no real advantage one has or the other, so it's pretty much the same thing in this regard. This is personally a plus for me since I usually prefer using the D-pad over the analog stick. The A button fires a pixie shot forward, the B button fires a pixie shot backwards, and that's it. You cannot jump in this game, you cannot crouch in this game, you cannot dodge or sidestep or perform any other actions but running and shooting magic pixie shots ahead or behind you. What the...
Okay, kiddies, this is a Nintendo 64 controller, the stock model that comes with every Nintendo 64 controller back in the day when the system was new. Now, you have your D-pad, which you use to move around. You have your analog stick, which you use to move around. You have these two buttons, which will allow you to fire forwards and backwards. Now, this leaves these four yellow buttons, which are usually camera controls or something like that, but they use them for other functions too. You have the two trigger buttons, and then you have another third button trigger here below. And you're telling me none of those extra buttons you could implement a jump feature. Really? No, really, like, okay, fine, dodging, alright, or like any of those advanced features, okay, fine, I can understand not implementing them, but jumping, really, jumping, pew, 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 I mean, Rangers jump, come on.
There seems to be only a handful of maps in this game where you're roaming around with your ranger, and these maps are recycled every so often with only the number of citizens to rescue and grunt placements changing between levels. Aside from the city with wide open areas, you also find in the subway, a cavern, and ancient ruins. Well, I'm guessing this is supposed to be the ocean floor. Well, you know what, we'll say ruins. The reason I bring this up is because the demons in Power Rangers Lightspeed Rescue have a thing against water. They can't touch water for some reason because apparently it hurts them. This is apparent in one of the episodes where the Blue Ranger fends off a bunch of monsters with a super soaker, all to defend a mermaid. I'm not making this up, I promise. The levels themselves are sparsely populated too. Your ranger runs too slowly. They tend to have problems climbing a slope of any kind. You know, if only they could f***ing jump. And there's very little in terms of variation in general. You just follow the red arrow on your radar to reach your next target, killing batlings and bosses along the way. And there's only like 3 or 4 bosses in the game total, and they all fight the same way. They basically lull around for a bit and shoot a projectile every so often. It's an extremely basic formula that is repeated over and over, and the only difficulty is the increased number of targets because that drags the game out a little longer, it's not all that great. And it probably goes without saying because you could see it with your own 2 eyes, but I probably will anyway. The Rangers in this game shoot magical pixie shots by punching or kicking. They don't pull out blasters or anything like that to shoot these shots because that would make sense. They use their hands and fists to shoot. Funny, in all the years that I've been watching Power Rangers, and yes, I actually watched Power Rangers back in the day, still do in limited quantities, I don't recall them being able to shoot magical pixie shots with their hands and fists. They just punch, kick, possess weapons of mass destruction, and giant mechanical robots of death. They do not shoot magical pixie shots from their hands and feet. It's just... The driving levels, where you either have to put out random fires with your cannon or run over radioactive spills to clean them up, they're pretty boring on a whole. You could slow down and shoot, and that's pretty much it. I suppose there's not much you can do here. I mean, well, wait, the controls are pretty piss poor here too, as it can get pretty difficult to accurately steer your vehicle. Probably a good thing because this means I could take damage by bumping into cars, and it's probably the closest I'll get to a legitimate challenge in this game. If you really want to be cheap, you could simply stay on the upper side of the street, sit back and relax, and nothing will ever touch you. I never went with this glitch because I struggle with the piss poor steering and bump into cars, watching as they bounce off the things like a goddamn pinball. How realistic. But then again, we're talking about a franchise where it's possible to breathe on the moon. No, really. The Megazord Battles are basically a poor man's first-person shooter where you simply launch missiles at your opponent. You have a defensive shield to block attacks, and you have power-ups to improve your chances of survival, power-ups that your opponent can also acquire, mind you, which adds some degree of challenge if you let your opponent grab one too many health pickups. But in the long run, this basically amounts to a big pile of nothing. You move around, you shoot missiles. If you get in close, you can punch the bastard, although this doesn't last long because he tends to run away. It's just not all that fun, and chances are the fights will be over rather quickly, which is a sad thing because you'd figure a fight between giant robots would be hard to screw up. Well, they did. I mean, I don't know what's worse in regards to sword interpretations, this or the lethargic quick-time sword action sequences in Power Rangers Super Legends for the PlayStation 2. Probably the most exciting mode in this game are the jet levels, where you're flying around Green Ranger's Zord and have to go around the city collecting crates, or in one case you're actually picking up other Rangers within a specified time limit, usually 5 minutes. This is actually the best part of the game because you get to fly around in the city and just plain old explore the city. Despite the time limit, you can futz around in the city and still have plenty of time to complete your objective. And while the controls aren't amazing in the least, they did use more than 2 face buttons, which is amazing considering everything else I played here. However, the levels are sparsely populated. There are a few enemies scattered here and there, and though it's better than the other levels, it's not saying a whole lot because even this gets boring after a while. On top of that, there's only a couple of these types of levels in the entire game, and the map layout doesn't change between the levels. So if you're bored of the main Titanium quest mode, whose plot revolves around defending the domed Titan city that they invented for the game and defending it from Diabolical, one of the main baddies from the TV show, who you never get to fight in this game, by the way, so that's a letdown right there. And also, the plot involves the acquisition of titanium power coins? I don't know. And a glorified Titanium Ranger cameo here and there. There's always the secondary Megazord Battle mode, which is just the aforementioned first-person shooter-style Zord fights. This is also the only mode where you can play with a second player, but good luck trying to convince anyone to play this game with you. Although the game allows you to alter the difficulty setting, and although you can save your progress, the truth is that the game is somewhat on the easy side. Despite the rather tepid performance on display here, I can honestly tell you that I've not died once in this game when I first played the game. As a matter of fact, I can also honestly tell you that I've beaten this game on my first playthrough, in one sitting. Even when your life is quickly being picked away by the batlings and projectiles, or ramming into cars in the driving levels, there is never a moment where you're even remotely threatened to lose because you'll always come across a health power-up, time pickup, or extra other power-up. The only time where the game is even remotely difficult is during the Zord fights, and that's only if you let your opponent pick up the constantly spawning power-ups to use against you. In fact, if you're lucky, you can just spam all your firepower at the boss and clear the level in a matter of seconds. It's over before it begins. It's just lousy. And what do you get when you beat the game? More lousy comic art with the instrumental theme song playing in the background and the ability to play alternate versions of specific levels. Oh well, I suppose I should be content that the game is won so I could put this one in a box somewhere and never speak of it again. In conclusion, Power Rangers Lightspeed Rescue for the Nintendo 64 isn't necessarily the worst game in gaming history, nor is it the most astronomically horrid piece of code ever conceived. It's just a boringly bad video game. While I like the attempt to diversify the gameplay here with the various modes, I simply don't like the execution. The end result being overly simplistic gameplay that is just too damn dull to play for extended periods of time unless you have really nothing better to do with your time. The overall presentation is also lacking with only a couple music tracks, lackluster graphics, and these god-awful cartoons that make babies cry. I mean really, is this the best THQ could come up with for a Power Rangers interpretation on Nintendo 64? A half-assed video game with sparsely populated levels, terrible cutscenes, and boring gameplay? This is just sad to watch, and even sadder is the fact that I played through the whole game in one sitting. But at the very least, I won't ever have to touch it again because I've seen all there is to see here. And neither should you have to touch this game. It just ain't worth it, man.